Psalm 10, verse 1. Why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In his arrogance, the wicked man hunts down the weak, who are caught in the schemes he devises. He boasts of the cravings of his heart. He blesses the greedy and reviles the Lord. In his pride, the wicked does not seek him. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. His ways are always prosperous. He is haughty, and your laws are far from him. He sneers at all his enemies. He says to himself, nothing will shake me. I will always be happy and never have trouble. His mouth is full of curses and lies and threats. Trouble and evil are under his tongue. He lies in wait near the villages. From ambush he murders the innocent, watching in secret for his victims. He lies in wait like a lion in cover. He lies in wait to catch the helpless. He catches the helpless and drags them off in his net. His victims are crushed. They collapse. They fall under his strength. He says to himself, God has forgotten. He covers his face and never sees. Arise, Lord. Lift up your hand, O God. Do not forget the helpless. Why does the wicked man revile God? Why does he say to himself, he won't call me to account? But you, O God, do see trouble and grief. You consider it, take it in hand. The victim commits himself to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked and evil man. Call him to account for his wickedness that would not be found out. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish from his land. You hear, O Lord, the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them and you listen to their cry, defending the fatherless and the oppressed, in order that man who is of the earth may terrify no more. I remember when I was still quite young, sitting on the stoop of our house in Madras, India, waiting for my parents to return home. My father was a minister and very often was called away for great lengths of time. These were the days before cell phones. We had a landline, but what was the point? You needed somewhere to call, and the person you were trying to call needed to be close to the phone where you were trying to call. I am explaining this for our younger audience. I would pace the front porch, stop and strain my eyes, looking past the gate at the bustling thoroughfare beyond our house, waiting, hoping that my dad would be just around the corner. Often, my dad's scooter puttered into the gate late into the evening, and there was relief and joy when he returned. But I remember long, unknowable silences, painful times of just waiting and thinking, how long? Friedrich Nietzsche was born, maybe of interest to Adventists, was born on October 1844. He was famous for capturing the essence of this question, how long? Where? The how long he was asking about was not about his own dad, but he was asking about God. He wrote a famous parable, which is now called the parable of the madman. Have you ever heard of the madman who on a bright morning lighted a lantern and ran to the marketplace, calling out unceasingly, I seek God, I seek God. As there were many people standing about who did not believe in God, he caused a great deal of amusement. Why? Is he lost? Said one. Has he strayed away like a child? Said another. Or does he keep himself hidden? Is he afraid of us? Has he taken a sea voyage? Has he emigrated? The people cried out laughingly, all in a hubbub. Nietzsche was a pastor's kid, and he himself had studied for the ministry. He was a brilliant student of the Bible. But as time went on, he could see from where he stood that all the progress and innovation and brilliance of our world was leading to a place where God would not be needed. Nietzsche lost his faith, but he mourned its passing. He knew that the world was experiencing a disappointment with God, a world where God was absent. And he knew that a world without God would be very different. Nietzsche continued the parable. He said, the insane man jumped into the midst of the people in the marketplace and transfixed them with his glances. Where is God gone? He called out. I mean to tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how have we done it? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe out the whole horizon? What did we do when we loosened this earth from its sun? Friedrich Nietzsche is now known as the father of a school of thought called nihilism, the idea that God is dead. And now, as a consequence, there is no right or wrong, there is no constraint, everything is empty, meaningless, void, dark, without hope. This is what the absence of God results in. The psalmist from the psalm we read today agrees with Nietzsche. Why, Lord, do you stand afar off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? God feels absent. Deus absconditis. What to do when God feels absent? There are times in the Bible where God appears in power. He works mightily. And then there are long spells where God seems absent. You can hear the sound of crickets riding tumbleweed across the centuries. Nothing. What do we do when God feels absent? And the reason that the psalmist feels God is absent is not because of some ethereal philosophical notion. The reason that the psalmist feels God is absent is because the wicked are prospering. That's contrary to what he knows should be happening. You'll remember he wrote in Psalm 1, the way to prosperity, the way to life, the way to flourishing is to delight in the law of the Lord. If we do so, he says, then, as a consequence, we will be like trees planted by streams of water, unmoved, evergreen, ever blessed to be a blessing. And then he says, the wicked are not so. They will not stand in the judgment. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the wicked will perish. This is how life ought to be. But they are not the way things are. The psalmist is very truthful. He says in the psalm we read, in his arrogance the wicked man hunts down the weak, who are caught in the schemes he devises. His mouth is full of lies and threats. Trouble and evil are under his tongue. He lies in wait near the villages. From ambush he murders the innocent. His eyes watch in secret for his victims. He's like a lion seeking to devour. Now, the psalmist is not alone in feeling the absence of God. There are other people in the Bible who also keenly felt the absence of God. Here is Job. Job said, the earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers the face of its judges. The he is talking about is God. If it is not he, then who is it? I cry out for help, but you do not answer me. You have become cruel to me. With the might of your hand you persecute me. When I expect good, then evil came. When I waited for light, then darkness came. God feels absent. In Psalm 2, the same psalmist gave us another doorway for how we can flourish. If you want to prosper, says Psalm 2, be wise, be warned, serve the Lord with fear, celebrate his rule with trembling. If you don't do this, the psalmist says, you'll be led to destruction. Well, in Psalm 10, the same psalmist says, the wicked don't serve the Lord with fear, and yet they flourish. He boasts about the cravings of his heart. He blesses the greedy and reviles the Lord. In his pride, the wicked man does not seek him. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. And then he says, his ways are always prosperous. What a disappointment. We began the book of Psalms by thinking that if we follow all God's laws, that was the secret to prosperity. If we follow God's Son, God's anointed King, we will be prosperous. Is God in charge? Is God's government going on? Why does God stay silent? You expect God to be speaking. In this psalm, it's the wicked who are very talkative. They are particularly audible. Psalmist says they boast about the desires of their heart. They bless the greedy. They revile the Lord. They say to themselves aloud with impunity, nothing will ever shake me. No evil will ever come to me. They say to themselves in the full hearing of others, God will never notice. God covers his face and never sees us. The prophet Isaiah put his disappointment with God this way. Justice is far from us. Righteousness does not overtake us. We hope for light, but behold darkness. For brightness, but we walk in gloom. We hope for justice, but there is none. God is absent. God feels absent. He says, what do we do when we feel God's absence? There are many answers to this question. Those who love God and those who hate God have answered this question in many ways in the thousands of years of Earth's history. The psalmist gives us a few ways of answering this. The first way, he answers the absence of God, what to do when God feels absent. The first answer the psalmist gives us is when God feels absent, you pray for God to act. Arise, Lord, lift up your hand, O God. Do not forget the helpless. He just calls God to act. You, God, see the afflicted. You consider their grief. Take it in hand. The victims commit themselves to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked man. Call the evildoer to account. The psalmist told us earlier that the wicked seem to be very active. They are laying traps. They are ensnaring the innocent. They are laying plans to deceive others. They ambush the innocent. They lie in wait. The wicked are busy. And this is so because God has given the wicked freedom to choose. God has respect for their power and their will to freely choose. The fact that that entire list of actions of the wicked is there is a testament to the freedom God gives to his creatures to freely choose between right and wrong. The psalmist understands that God must respect their free will even if they choose to use it for wrong. And he is praying that God will use God's will, God's free will, to act. They have used their free will. He says, you use yours. Arise, Lord. Lift up your hand. Do not forget the helpless. He asks God to see and defend and consider, break the arms of the wicked, call them to account, encourage the afflicted. The first thing to do when you feel God's absence, the psalmist says, you pray and ask God to act. You may say, well, I've prayed that many times. Nothing ever happens. The author Ann Dillard lived for 2 years on the Puget Sound in Washington State. And she wrote about some of her experiences in a collection of essays. In one of them, she wrote, "There is one church here, so I go to it. On Sunday mornings, I quit the house and wander down the hill to the white-framed church in the firs. On a big Sunday, there might be 20 of us there. Often, I am the only person under 60 and feel as though I am on an archaeological tour of Soviet Russia." She means they all look decrepit. "The members are of mixed denominations. The minister is a Congregationalist and wears a white shirt. The man knows God. Once in the middle of a long pastoral prayer of intercession for the whole world, for the gift of wisdom to its leaders, for hope and mercy to the grieving and pained, succor to the oppressed, and God's grace to all, in the middle of this, he stopped and burst out, 'Lord, we bring these same petitions to you every week.' After a shocked pause, he continued reading the prayer. 'Because of this, I like him very much.' What do you do when God feels absent? You pray that God will act. Ask God to act. It may seem like nothing is happening. Lord, I bring these petitions, these same petitions to you every week. You keep asking. In the great controversy between Christ and Satan, there are rules of engagement. One is that God values love. And because God values love, God gives the ability of free will to everyone. You can choose whether to love him or not. Unfortunately, many choose not to love him and follow evil. That's one rule of engagement. The other rule of engagement is that although God will not obstruct our freedom of will, if we ask him to, he will intervene. If we ask him, he will intervene. God will intervene in a way that is perfect, that does not infringe on the free will of others. He will act in a way that seeks the best for his children. He acts in a way that best advances his plan to redeem and restore all things. It may not conform to my timetable. God may not act in ways that I expect. But according to the rules of engagement, if I ask, he will intervene. What do you do when God feels absent? You pray and ask God to act. He will. The psalmist goes further. What do you do when God feels absent? The psalmist remembers to put his trust in the reign of God. He says, "The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish from his land." You'll remember in Psalm 2, the Lord says to his anointed king, "Ask of me, and I will give you the nations as your inheritance." The Israelites went into the land of Canaan. The nations did not become their inheritance. Instead of them inheriting the nations sought to inherit them. Things were upside down. God seemed absent. David remembers to trust in the reign of God. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish. It may seem like it hasn't happened, but he says it will. It's coming. The nations will perish. It may seem like the wicked are prospering today. It may seem like death is victorious today. But the psalmist promises us that the Lord will outlast all of these. He is king forever and ever and ever. Whatever he has promised will be fulfilled. He will do so gloriously. I want to remind you that Jesus experienced the silence of God. Jesus experienced the silence of the Father, the absence of the Father. On the cross, Jesus cried out, "Father, Father, why have you forsaken me?" The same words of the psalmist, "How long? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" were also in the mouth of Jesus, in the mind of Jesus. His life was broken for us in that darkness, in that absence. It was broken and blessed for us, and it works out the fulfilling of God's reign. By his death, Jesus has reconciled our family, our human family. God has worked his purposes out, even in that darkness. And he has done so gloriously. The author Meg Woodson and her husband had 2 children, Peggy and Joey. Both had been diagnosed with cystic fibrosis at an early age. Neither of them were expected to make it to adulthood. They stayed skinny no matter how much they ate. They stayed skinny. They coughed constantly and they labored to breathe. Twice a day, Meg had to pound their chests to release mucus. Several times in a year, they spent a significant amount of time in a hospital. And they both knew that they would probably die before they reached full adulthood. Joey, who was bright and happy, died at the age of 12. But Peggy, his sister, defied the odds. She lived on. Thousands of people were praying for Peggy. They prayed for God to act. They knew there were no recorded miraculous healings of cystic fibrosis. They prayed anyway. Peggy survived several health crises in high school, and then she went away to college. She seemed to be growing stronger, not weaker. And for all those who were praying for Peggy, their hopes rose that she would find healing after all. Then there was no miracle. Peggy died at the age of 23. Meg wrote much later that the weekend before Peggy died, she went into the hospital for the last time, but that weekend before she had gone to the hospital, she came home from church all excited about a quotation from her minister that morning. She was so taken with it that she had it copied down on a 3x5 card and kept it with her. The minister had said, "Endurance is not just the ability to bear a hard thing, but to turn it into glory." She said her minister must have had a hard week because after he read it, he banged the pulpit and turned his back to the congregation and cried. After Peggy had been in the hospital for a while, things were not going well, she said. She looked around all that paraphernalia of death to which she was attached, and then she said, "Hey, Ma, remember that quotation?" And she looked around again at all the tubes, stuck the tip of her tongue out of the corner of her mouth, nodded her head, and raised her eyes in excitement at the experiment to which she was committing herself to. Endurance is not just the ability to bear a hard thing, but to turn it into glory. Once the president of her college came to visit her in the hospital, and he asked her if there was anything specific he could pray for. She was too weak to talk, but she nodded to her mom to explain to her this quote from her preacher. And he asked her to pray that her hard time would be turned into glory. Amen. Peggy died. It was particularly difficult. Her prayers, the prayers of thousands of others, were not answered in the way they were expecting for it to be answered, or the way they desired for it to be answered. God seemed absent. God seemed silent. But like the psalmist, she put her trust in the one who is king forever and ever and ever. He will turn hard times into glory. I learned a beautiful way of looking at this from Tim Keller. He was a young pastor, 24 years old, in rural Virginia. And he tells a story of an older lady that he would visit often. She had been through a lot of difficulty. In addition to her physical ailments, people had treated her poorly. And he said, I would visit her often and say, "Oh, Alice, I'm so sorry for what has happened to you." And she would listen to him and say, "But you know something, Tim? The Lord is doing such and such in my life. And the Lord is making a way for such and such in my life." And some weeks later, he would go back and visit her, and he would say, "Alice, I'm so sorry for the way this person has treated you." And she would listen to him and say, "But you know, Tim, the Lord is working this out, and the Lord is helping me with this other thing." And every time Tim brought up her misfortune and speak about it, she would look at him and talk about what God was doing and speak about how God was going to deliver her. Keller thought about this, and he says, I imagine that Christians are people inside a fort. They're being attacked and bombarded from all sides. People inside the fort can't help but focus on the fort being encircled, and the gates being rammed, and the walls being scaled, and fiery arrows flying overhead. But then he says there are some people in the fort who climb up to a tall tower, and they look out, and they see in the distance reinforcements coming in the distance. Those reinforcements are far bigger, far greater than the enemy standing outside the gates. When they see that army coming, they smile because they know the battle is already won. There's not a chance. Keller said, I was like a Christian inside the fort. Alice was like a Christian on top of the tower. I was focused on the enemy doing things. Alice was focused on the reinforcements that were coming. And she could smile because the Lord is king forever and ever, and she knows the battle is already won. Scott Johnson was called to be the pastor of the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City. He arrived at the church in the year 2008, just in time for the world to collapse economically. The church had already been in some debt. And then, when this happened, they were really in trouble. And Scott said, you think other people took the financial collapse seriously. He says, New Yorkers climbed the walls. He said, I had one panic-struck board meeting after another about what we're going to do. What are you going to do? We're going to have to cut staff. We're going to have to cut the budget. What are we going to do? He said, I was trying to pastor them, trying to calm them down. We would get to the end of a really panic-struck board meeting, and someone would say, okay, I think we've got it now. As long as another shoe doesn't drop, and then another shoe would drop as the economy spiraled down. And then they'd have another board meeting, and it would end, and someone would say, okay, I think we've got it now. As long as another shoe doesn't drop, and then another shoe would drop. He said, I was doing pretty well until one afternoon I was in my office by myself, and there all of a sudden, for some reason, fear seized me. I suddenly became convinced that I was going to preside over the failure of this congregation, and I was paralyzed with fear. He said, I put my head in my hands and I blurted out a prayer to God. Oh God, please, no more shoes. No more shoes. Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? He said, I had no sooner gotten the prayer out when there was a knock on the door. It was the maintenance person. Dr. Johnston, you better come down to the night shelter, he said. They had a night shelter for homeless people. And Scott thought, oh, now what? He went down to the night shelter, and sure enough, there were 2 New York City policemen waiting there for him. And one of them said, Pastor, We have just raided an illegal factory in Brooklyn. They were manufacturing counterfeit Timberland boots. We have seized the inventory, and we thought the homeless could use them. We have 700 pairs of shoes for you. Scott said he didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. When God seems absent, and it seems like God is hiding in times of trouble, by the grace of God, the first thing we are called to do is to pray and ask God to act. He will act. May not be in my time, may not be in the way I desire Him to act. He will act. These are the rules of engagement in the great controversy. And the second thing is, I am called to trust in God, who is King forever and ever and ever. The enemy will perish. God's deliverance will come. He will turn hard things into glory.